Welcome to Living Word Ministries with our director and Bible teacher, Debbie Blank. Debbie's passion is for you to understand and apply God's truths to your life. Now let's listen and enjoy teaching from the Word of God with Debbie Blank.
So here we see a timing that we've got the Ancient of Days sitting in the courts that could very well be the beginning of the tribulation period, because Jesus then comes and goes to the Ancient of Days. And then after he goes to the Ancient of Days, at some period thereafter, he's given dominion and takes that dominion later. Now, that may be a little confusing because you might think, well, he's going before the Ancient of Days, he's given dominion, he immediately starts reigning in his kingdom. But that's not the case. Turn to Revelation 11. Because the timing of Revelation 11 is right in the middle of the tribulation period. 3.5 years into the middle of the tribulation period. And it tells us in verse 15, right at that middle point, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. Well, if you read that, you think, okay, Christ is coming right here. But he's not. He doesn't come for 3.5 more years. What has happened is the end has started. The idea is that Christ has begun his reign, but before he can do that, he must fulfill the wrath of God in order to get to the reign and the millennial kingdom. So even though it looks like Christ is coming right here in Revelation, he's not. He's not coming for 3.5 years. Even though it looks like Christ is coming here because it says it, he's coming to the Ancient of Days. Then once the wrath of God takes place, 7 years, then Christ will come and reign in his kingdom. Is that completely confusing to everybody? Okay, the question is, when the Ancient of Days comes and courts are set up, is this in the earth or is this in heaven? If it matches with Revelation 5, it's in heaven. Okay? The courts are set up in heaven. Let's turn to John 5 to finish answering that. Because what John 5 tells us is that God gives authority to Jesus to judge. In verse 22 it says, "For not even the Father judges anyone, but he has given all judgment to the Son." Then if you look at verse 27, he says, "And he gave Jesus authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man." So God's setting up the courts. Jesus is coming before him to be given the authority to execute the judgment. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen right then. It's the start of the judgment. I see this judgment as being 7 years long, culminating with the return of Jesus Christ. Now, do you see why it's important to understand that time frame that I showed you earlier? We have the Gentile nations. We have the Antichrist. We have God on the throne giving Jesus the book in Revelation 5 that may well match up with here, which starts the judgment of 7 years that will continue for 7 years until Jesus returns and establishes his millennial kingdom. She mentioned a term that we'll see later in Daniel, the abomination of desolation, which is something that happens 3.5 years into the tribulation. The Antichrist, however, begins the tribulation. He, however, it appears from Revelation 13, he is not necessarily empowered by Satan until he appears to die. Then he's empowered by Satan, and then all the satanic activity happens the last 3.5 years. Before that, it'll be hell on earth, because I don't believe the church will be here, and the Antichrist will be ruling in his way, but we won't have satanic action until the last 3.5 years when Satan is thrown down, at least as bad as it's going to get. If the fourth beast is Islam, as Z suggested, Islam must be taken out of the way before the Jews can build a temple on the Temple Mount, because there is not a practicing Muslim on this earth, I don't believe, who would allow the Jewish temple to be built on the Temple Mount. Unless it's what? Unless it's not going to be built on the Temple Mount. So also what he was saying too is that the war of Gog and Magog of Ezekiel 38 and 39 could take place before this. It could, if the fourth beast is Islam, the war of Ezekiel 38 and 39 takes place before it, which is all Islamic nations except Russia, and they're destroyed. They're which might go along with this verse in 11, the beast was slain, the kingdom of Islam was slain, the different kingdom was slain, so it would be talking about a kingdom rather than a person, then that would open the door for the Antichrist to rise from there. A lot of interesting possibilities here. A lot of somewhat confusion for us, but even in the confusion, we're still seeing a pattern. We're seeing Gentile nations, we're seeing the Ancient of Days sitting in his court and allowing Jesus to begin the judgment that will take place 7 years, and then Jesus will receive his kingdom. That we know for sure in what we're seeing. If you look at a map of the old Roman Empire, the eastern half is all Muslim now, the western half is Europe. That could mean the feet of iron and clay, where you have the iron being Europe and the clay being Islam in this final world kingdom. We better move on or we're never going to understand what Daniel's vision means. So let's move on and see if we can get an interpretation. Daniel 7:15 says, "As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me." Now, after he'd just seen the Ancient of Days and he'd just seen about the Messiah coming, don't you think he'd be joyful and happy? Well, he's understanding that all this terror is going to take place on his people. He's terrified. He's broken. That's how we should have felt. That's how we should feel when things happen to our country that are against God. We should have the same attitude that Daniel has. We should be alarmed and distressed as he was. Even though there's always hope, we should be alarmed and distressed.
Lead the way, Debbie.
Yeah.
We'll be right behind you.
Yeah. Verse 16, "I approached one of those who was standing by and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things." Who's standing by? I mean, isn't that a little interesting? Remember, Daniel's the one that's been interpreting dreams. He's not interpreting this. He's asking somebody else now. Gabriel. Gabriel's mentioned several times in the book of Daniel. It could very well be Gabriel. Clearly, it must be somebody who can interpret it, which has to be an angel. His 3 friends. Okay? Could be. I approached one of those who was standing by. Could be. But it certainly is different. Daniel can't interpret this one. And the summary, in verses 17 and 18 now, we have the summary verse of this chapter. Because it says, "These great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth." That's another idea there that these could be future. Even though it's the imperfect tense and it's really not giving us a future tense. We think will is future. But this is the imperfect tense in this verb. So it doesn't necessarily mean future. But a lot of people would think that these are kings that Z mentioned. So we have 4 kings who are going to rise from the earth, 4 kingdoms. Verse 18, "But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come." Who are the saints of the highest one? We are. Anyone who's believed in Jesus Christ, the Messiah. The Jews of old who've had faith in Messiah, the people of the New Testament who have also. So even in the midst of this horrible explanation of what's going to happen, God gives them hope by letting them know that they're going to be in the fulfillment of prophecy from elsewhere, that the saints are going to reign and possess the kingdom. Now, this is a statue that I got off the internet that may well represent what we've seen. Again, this doesn't match up with what Z says, but this is the idea of what we've been talking about. The kingdoms, then the final divided kingdom of iron and clay, and then the stone cut without arms, and the stone filling the earth, which is Jesus Christ. That's certainly what the statue of Daniel 2 said. Do these beasts match that? They do. On the other hand, they could be future kingdoms. There's 2 different beliefs on that. All right, now let's look at Daniel 7:19. "Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others." And he's stressing that word different. This is not your normal kingdom, folks. That's why Islam could easily fit in here, because it is not like any other kingdom that's ruled the world. It's exceedingly dreadful. That exceedingly wasn't mentioned before. with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze. Claws of bronze wasn't mentioned before. And which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head. We didn't know that from before. And the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell. We were told earlier that 3 of them were pulled out. Now we know a little bit more specifically that they fell to the power of the little horn. Namely, that the horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great boasts, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. Haven't seen that before either. What idea do you get if it's larger than its associates? Okay, bigger, stronger, more powerful than its associates. Verse 21, I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with whom? The saints, and overpowering them. We can read about that in Revelation. Matter of fact, let's go to Revelation 12, because we want to see how much Daniel matches up with the book of Revelation. Or I guess we should say Revelation matches up with Daniel. Daniel gives us just an outline. Revelation gives us some pretty intense explanations of what we see in Daniel. In Daniel 12, starting with let's start with verse 13. It says, when the dragon, we know that to be Satan in this context, saw that he was thrown down to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. In the context there, that's Israel. And the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to Israel in order that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, which was nurtured for, how long? Time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. We're going to see that exact time phrase in a minute. And the serpent poured water out like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. So we see there just an example of the persecution that's going to take place from this 4th beast to the Jews, the saints, and overpowered them. And he's going to overpower them until when in verse 22? It says, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. And the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. So there's going to be this 7-year period of time when the 4th beast is going to wage war, or at least part of the 7-year time. Based on that, it's 3.5 years. Based on what we're going to see in a minute, it's going to be 3.5 years. Now let's find out the interpretation. I put bullet points on here. They may be hard for you to see, but sometimes it's easier for me to see things in bullet points because it's very clear what the angel or the friends or whomever is interpreting this for Daniel excuse me, is saying. Thus he said, the 4th beast will be a 4th kingdom on the earth. Now we know from Revelation 17 that they're kings and kingdoms. They're synonymous with each other. This is a 4th kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. Now, right now we've not seen a kingdom that has done that. We've seen Islam conquering much of the world. They are in control predominantly, a vast majority in 55 countries of the 204 countries in the world. So they have controlled 1/4 of the countries on the earth right now. The Muslims have, but not the whole earth. Verse 24, as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. So we're going to have the kingdom, and then that kingdom's going to start out with what? 10 kings. Does that match up with anything you've seen before? The 10 toes of the statue of Daniel. The idea of 10 kings. We're going to see later, well, we won't see, but in the book of Revelation, if you were to look in the book of Revelation, in chapter 12, verse 3, then in chapter 13, then in chapter 17, verse 3, but 17, verse 12 tells us clearly that these kings are, I forgot where I was going with that. Anyway, that these 10 horns are 10 kings, and they are 10 kingdoms, and they are going to participate with the final world leader, the Antichrist, in the ruling of the world. Those other chapters and verses in the Bible tell us that. So the 10 horns match up with the 10 toes of the final world kingdom, with the 10 horns that are going to be on the head of the Antichrist, on the head of the Satan, the dragon, in the book of Revelation. We see similarities here. We have not yet seen a kingdom that is divided into 10 kingdoms. But I've mentioned to you before that several years ago, actually, I think it was 2009, the United Nations came out with a map dividing the world into 10 sustainable development areas. They also came out with a map in the 50s dividing the world into 10 areas. They weren't called sustainable development back then. The United Nations already has the idea that we're going to divide the world up into 10. And I've got to tell you, when I heard President Obama's speech yesterday, parts of it, and he talked about bringing all the idea, and I'm paraphrasing here, basically bringing all the nations together and working together with all the nations, I thought, wow, that's exactly what the Antichrist is going to do. He's going to work with all the nations. I mean, what other Western power would work with Cuba, would work with Iran, would work with these terrorist countries? We've never had one. But our president is building that idea of working together with everyone. So this final kingdom is going to be broken into 10 kings or 10 kingdoms. But it says here that the little horn, or the Antichrist, will rise up and he's going to pluck out 3 of them. So he's going to get rid of 3 of these kingdoms, 3 of these divisions, 3 of these sections of the world he's going to usurp. Will he conquer them for himself, or will he give them to his friends? So there's only 7, we don't know. But we do know the world's going to be divided. In this day and age that we're living in, can you imagine that happening? We really can. I mean, 50 years ago, we couldn't. 100 years ago, we certainly couldn't. But we have a World Health Organization. We have the stock markets that are interdependent on each other financially, because worldwide we're interdependent financially. We have so many world ecological aspects that work together. We have the United Nations, which is a world organization. By the way, do you know why United Nations was formed? Do you know what their one objective was? To bring peace. Is it working? No, it's failing miserably. And yet they're being given more power. That makes no sense to me, except that God's preparing for these end times. Let's go on now. This little horn, who is definitely the Antichrist, whether he's the king of the final kingdom or whatever, the little horn is the Antichrist. He will speak out against the Most High. Who's the Most High? God. Do the Muslims believe in the God of the Bible? No, they believe in Allah, who is different than the God of the Bible. This could very well match up with him. He's going to wear down the saints of the highest one. That's the Jews. He will intend to make alterations in time and in law. Now, for years, I just thought, well, that could be anything. But now you have to understand, the Muslims follow their own time period. It's called AH. Anybody know what it stands for? Anno Hagira. And that's in the day of the flight or something like that. They start counting their calendar in 622 AD when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. So they are in the year 1436 of their calendar, and that's all they follow. They don't follow the Western calendar, because the Western calendar is built on what? Christ. BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini, after Christ. The world is changing that now. We are now BCE, which stands for before the Common Era, and CE or ACE, after the Common Era or the Common Era. The world is changing it. They're taking Christ out of our dating system. But Muslims would do that in a heartbeat. Now, Jews would do it too. They have their own dating system. They are in the year 5775. But the Jews, at least so far, have never tried to bring anybody else into their personal dating system. But whoever this Antichrist is going to try to make alterations in times and in law. Does that sound familiar? The theme, the goal of ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood and other radical terrorist Islamic organizations is to bring the whole world under Sharia law and under a one-world caliphate, a one-world leader. That's exactly what we're talking about here. They're attacking our laws. That's right. And they're attacking our laws as well as other people because our laws are built on the Ten Commandments. Alterations in times. Our attitudes are changing in everything that we do. So this Antichrist is going to try and do all this. And then it says they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Isn't that interesting? That matches up exactly with Revelation 12 that I just read to you. That he's going to pursue the Jews for a time, times, and half a time. How long is time, times, and half a time? It's 3.5 years. Now, it doesn't say here it's 3.5 years. You have to take it by the rest of the book of Revelation and by other parts of the scripture. Time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a times would be a half a year. That's 3.5 years. It matches up in Revelation with 1,260 days, 42 months, and 3.5 years that are all mentioned. All 4 of those timings are mentioned in the book of Revelation, which confirms to us that this is 3.5 years. This matches with the book of Revelation that for 3.5 years, the Antichrist is going to pursue the Jews, and he's going to have the authority on this world to do it. But, verse 26, the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole earth will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. And he did, and we're going to find out in chapter 12, God told him to keep the matter to himself until the end days. But for here, we've got the Antichrist who's been revealed. This fourth beast is the fourth kingdom, and in this fourth kingdom is going to arise it's going to be made up of 10 kingdoms. There's going to arise one person who's going to get rid of 3 of the kingdoms, and this is going to be the Antichrist. So this is primarily who we're talking about here, dealing with this fourth beast. That's why this kingdom is dreadful and terrifying. That's why this little horn is dreadful and terrifying, because he's the Antichrist. He's going to speak out against God. He's going to try and change times. He's going to try and change the laws. He's going to pursue the Jews for 3.5 years, as Revelation said. But is he going to win? No, he's not. He's going to be annihilated and destroyed forever. I love the verse 27 because it says, after that happens and after he's destroyed, when it says then, we're in a time phrase. Then the sovereignty and dominion and the greatness of all the kingdoms of the whole heaven will be given to the saints of the highest one. If we read, we don't have time. If you read Isaiah 62 verses 2 to 4 only, though much of the chapter is about it, Isaiah 62 talks about how the Jews are going to reign over all the peoples of the earth. Those are believers from other kingdoms, from other nations, the Gentile believers who are on the earth at that time, who've made it through the tribulation, and they're believers. The Jews are going to rule over them. They're going to have dominion over them, it says right here. And the dominion they're going to have, they'll experience for 1,000 years with Jesus in his millennial kingdom, where it is, and then it says his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, because after the millennial kingdom, then we go into eternity, which is an everlasting kingdom. So we have a time sequence. We may not understand who the players are exactly, but we do know who the little horn is. The little horn is the Antichrist. So we have Gentile nations that are going to rule over the Jewish people until such a time comes when this dreadful and terrifying kingdom arises. The world empire, I believe, is the one world empire. Could be the Muslims, could be whatever, but this one world empire is going to rise. It's going to be made up of 10 nations, but the Antichrist is going to rise to the top. It's like he's going to be the president of this kingdom, and he's going to try and destroy the Jews, but it's not going to work. God's going to intervene. Jesus will return. God will intervene. He will set up his kingdom, and the Jews will reign with Jesus in that kingdom. Everything we're talking about is exactly what's the Muslims' mentality and their goal. Let me finish with one last verse. It tells us in Revelation 20, verse 6, "Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power. They will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years." That's what believers have to look forward to if they make it through this tribulation period. So, we end this tonight. Maybe some of you are confused because we've given you some different options as to who these four beasts are. Who these four beasts are. The most important thing to understand is God has laid out the plan for the future, which is Gentile kingdoms, a final kingdom, a world leader called the Antichrist in this kingdom. He will reign, we know from Revelation, for 7 years. 3.5 years of that, he's going to persecute the Jews. But Jesus returns, and then he ushers in his millennial kingdom, where after he's brought judgment on the world, he will live in dominion with the Jews in that millennial kingdom. That's what we saw at the beginning of class. That's what God tells us. It's all laid out here in chapter 7. The only thing we don't know is who these beasts are before. Are they the statue from Daniel 2? Are they modern day empires? That's really not important to the theme of this chapter. Isn't that great? I mean, the whole book of Revelation tells us what we just learned in one chapter here. Amazing how God does this. The question for you tonight, because there's not a ton of application of this for us, except, are you ready? Now, God tells us in the New Testament and the Old Testament this is going to happen. He confirms it with different authors, different writers, different time periods, different ways of speaking. He confirms the exact same thing, that this will happen. This is God's plan for the ages. That means that pretty soon the Ancient of Days is going to sit on his throne, and the courts, the books are going to be open. The courts are going to be open, the books are going to be open, and his judgment is going to start. Now, if you want to know what that judgment is really going to be like, you've got a little idea of it here, but you get a much bigger idea of it by reading the book of Revelation, chapters 6 through 19. It's going to be hell on earth like you've never seen. I don't want to be here. The only way that we could have the possibility of not being here is if we have committed our lives to Jesus Christ before this starts. Otherwise, we'll go through it. I want to know where I'm going. I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to be part of God's wrath. Romans 8:1 says there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. If you'll commit your life to him today, you have no condemnation. He will take care of you.
Thank you for joining us today on Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank. Please tune in each week at the same time for Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank.